Welcome to another of our SEDAR webinars, the SEDAR Director Network conversations that we've been having. And the idea of these is that we can provide some insight into the world of directorship, into boardroom performance, and answer some key questions that are in many people's minds, as well as touch on some of the insights that have come out of our recent SEDAR survey. The topic of this survey is about independent directors and the way they impact the performance of companies. The key measure, obviously, that we see on the screen is EBITDA. And so what we want to do is really unpack some thoughts in terms of what does this mean? What do we mean by increased performance? Why it happens, some thoughts, and then how independent directors can contribute. And we recognize that some of you are sitting here saying, you know, how's that going to affect my business? We maybe need to bring directors into the business. Some of you are sitting as independent directors and saying, well, what's expected of me when I sit around the boardroom table? My name is Roger Hitchcock. I'm a senior partner with the SEDAR Group, and SEDAR have been involved in the boardroom space for more than the last decade. I've also had the privilege of spending the last decade in and out of boardrooms, really assisting directors answer questions about how they increase value and add value. The SEDAR Group as a whole is involved throughout primarily the African region. We have an African footprint, offices in both East Africa, in Kenya, West Africa, in Ghana, and then South Africa. I'm presenting to you from, or speaking to you from Pretoria, in a warming up South Africa, which I am appreciative of. Essentially, in terms of the scope of what SEDAR do, is we're involved in everything from knowledge and education and training directors, because I think one of the key things we're seeing from much of the news flow is that often directors sit on boards with very little understanding, or even the wrong understanding of what it means to direct companies. And part of that relates to what we're going to talk about today. What is the purpose of a company? We talk about profitability, we talk about all those things, but is that a target or is it a fruit? And I think that's an important thing to consider. We also help match directors and companies, where companies are wrestling with the question of who should sit on our board. How do we think about that, especially in a world where one of the key themes about boards is it can't just be someone we necessarily know, you know, we've known for many years, but actually it's a board as a group of people who add value, who build value, who grow value in the company as a whole. And then also we help guide the process. And so please contact us to find out more about that as we go. Rules of engagement for the webinar. I have got both the chat box and the Q&A box open in front of me, along with a list of participants. That's why sometimes my eyes go somewhere else. It's good to see some of some familiar names on the list. Welcome. Thank you for investing the time on an ongoing basis. Some of you have spotted regularly attending our webinars. Please use those to engage. This webinar is valuable, not just because of what we present, but also in terms of what questions you have in your mind. We won't necessarily get to all of them, but I'm happy to engage. I'm happy to be distracted by questions as I go. And, you know, I think the key thing is to think about, you know, how do we apply this in the boardroom going forward? The premise of this webinar is based on SEDAR's recent survey results, the 2019 results of our non-executive and independent directors' fees, performance and diversity survey. Quite a mouthful, but essentially 2 or 3 years ago, SEDAR took the view that there's very little, especially in the African continent, to benchmark a lot of the questions we are getting against. For instance, how much do we pay directors? What should directors be doing? And the question we're going to unpack today is, what do directors do, especially independent directors, do to companies, especially family-held businesses, privately held businesses? Our footprint is far broader than that, but that's the focus of a lot of the work that we have had the privilege of doing. And so you can get the results in the more complete survey. We're trying to, over this series, is pick up on some of the key highlights and unpack those in terms of some of the detail and the data. There is also, we've recently launched the 2020 survey, and we'd love you to participate, especially if you're sitting as an independent or non-executive director of a family held or privately held business. And there's certainly growing numbers of people who are being put into those positions. I was literally earlier this morning on an event where all the questions we got were about how do we think about composing our board, and I suppose that's one of the key questions. So it's the board and performance, and how are those linked? Last week I spoke through composing a board, and in a sense this week's webinar is the second half of that, because it's not just about the who, but it's about what directors do and what are some of the elements. And so I'm going to talk through some concepts of governance architecture, thinking about what are the elements we need to think about. This group of people that we put together in the room quite intentionally, as discussed last week, and the webinar will be available on the SEDAR site. This is, in a sense, part two of that, is to say, well, let's look at the elements to consider in terms of performance, why we believe this, we're seeing an increase, and you see an increase in performance, both in terms of sustainability. So one of the other things, and it's not directly related to the SEDAR survey, but many surveys are coming out with similar findings, that ultimately you put people in the room who have a different perspective and a different view. And that's one of the key things that independent directors are expected to bring to the table. It's not that they're there just to be the policeman or the questioner or the, hold a whip over others, but it's the different view on the business. And I think directing is often about what we see and how we respond to what we see. And working essentially from the picture of the future to the present. And then what is the role of independent directors linked to company performance? In thinking about this, I think, I always like to think of a quote that sums up essentially the message of today. And Stephen Covey said something, and it was, whether he was quoting someone else, I'm not sure, but he said, the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. And if one thing summarizes the role of effective independent directors, it's the fact that they're able to assist the board as a whole, keep the main thing all the time. And so the context of that is understanding the role of directors, all directors, because all directors are under exactly the same legal set of requirements, whether they're executive or non-executive or independent or any of the other diversity of titles that we use for directors. Is essentially the main thing is the company. And often it's that perspective, because recognizing that other directors, they could be non-executives, but they could be related to the company in other ways. Executive directors have a perspective on a part of the company, either their shareholding relationship with the company, either the executive function in the company. But actually sitting around the boardroom table, the most important thing is to see the whole company, see this legal person that we are accountable for, and recognizing that there is a complexity or diversity of relationships and challenges and operations that need to be kept in tension. But the main thing is the best interests of the company. And that, in a sense, summarizes the conclusion I'm going to get to today when we think about it. So based on the survey, as I said, the survey was designed to ask a set of questions around fees, performance, and structure of boards. That's why we include the concept of diversity there as well. And some key findings. The key finding, as we mentioned, is, and it's phrased in the negative in the findings in the survey, boards without independent directors are less likely to report an increase of EBITDA. And I think one of the challenges is obviously what do we mean by those different elements? There's the increase, because governing a company is about not just where it is presently, but where is it going to be in the future. And so we expect there to be trends and movement in terms of some of these numbers. And what we've seen is that based on the survey findings, when independent directors are introduced into the equation of the boardroom, the trend from there on in tends to be an increase in profitability ultimately in the business. And that's one of the key things. We often also see alongside that, either a sustainability, a consolidation, more comfort with the substance of the company, and also sometimes a link to growth of the company as well. But those are all interrelated terms. The key finding is that boards with at least one independent director, so it only takes one. Okay. Often we find that that boards, the recommendation, obviously in structuring boards, is a majority of independent directors, especially among the non-executives. But actually it takes it takes the right perspective, and it only takes one of those perspectives, playing the board game right at independent director level to lead to some of the changes. A related finding, respondents about independent directors on their board, and if they'd remove any of them in order to improve performance, and 82% of them said they wouldn't. And so we recognize that in some places, in some cases, companies have experimented with this concept of independence at their board, and it may not have worked. I've had conversations with people who said, no, we tried that, it didn't work. You know, it's finding the right person and the right team, and that we spoke about last time. But there's this overwhelming evidence that there is value in these people that are sitting there with this different perspective. Some of the other elements, and we'll move into some specifics now, but you know, boards with at least one independent director are outperforming boards without one. And one of the other key related findings is this one, that boards without independent directors evaluated themselves poorly compared to boards with at least one independent director. And so that's either the formal board evaluation process or an ongoing continuous improvement attitude or culture at board levels. And so coming out of that, I think one of the key things to recognize is that an independent director who is playing their part well is more aware of the fact that this is a increasing and improving role. In other words, it's a work in progress. Often what happens when people have founded businesses or they've sat on a board for a long time, they often become very settled in the status quo. This is the way that it is, often because of other relationships, shareholding relationships. You know, that's not going to change. This isn't going to change. We've got this far. Whereas an independent director often brings to the table this view that it could be better and it should be better. It should be better both in terms of myself. We often find that one of the key characteristics of good independent directors is they look at their own performance skeptically. In other words, they are continually looking for how they improve themselves. They look at how the board functions skeptically. Again, how can we do it better? How can we improve everything from the information flow to the type of information, to the engagement, to the conversations, to the decision making? It's that continual improvement attitude to then the company, because that flows through to the company. If boards aren't trying to improve themselves, how can they expect for the company to be improved? Because what happens in the boardroom sets the tone for what happens in the rest of the company as well. And that examination, that stepping back, it's often called the meta view, the Greek word meta being about. So it's not just in the company that the independent director is looking at, as many executives are, but it's on the company. It's about the company as a whole and how it fits together. And so when we unpack that, what are some of the perspectives that board members actually bring to the table? What are some of the other things to consider? Often what happens is that a good, well-qualified, well-matched independent director has a way of unpacking some of the additional complexities of drivers and outcomes that organizations are looking for. A simple one is that often what independent directors do is they take the focus off profitability as the pure driver. In other words, away from numbers. You know, they'll keep that in mind, but recognize that ultimately numbers are the result of what we do. And I'm thinking numbers in terms of profitability and even EBITDA. It's a result, it's not a target. And so even just that perspective is valuable, because ultimately, if we think about, and so at Sadal, we have this tool called the Enterprise Governance Compass. And the north-south element is what I'm talking about there, is that ultimately organizations exist for a purpose. They have a rationale, a reason for being, a promise, whatever we want to talk about or label we want to put on that. The returns that are achieved are a result of pursuing that well. And so often we find that the introduction of an independent director into the room and the conversation lifts the level of strategic conversation and moves it away from just measuring everything according to the numbers, which are an outcome, obviously, of the right thing, to saying, actually, let's recognize that we've got to focus on achieving, accomplishing, delivering our purpose and our promise and our reason for being. Obviously spelt out in terms of strategy and thinking about that, and not just thinking about what's left behind. And I know that that perspective, you know, is often a difficult one when in the room we have people who are, you know, sitting in all three seats of shareholder, director, and manager. Maybe they've grown up in the business as without a formal board, and so introducing, you know, the more formal board with other perspectives. This is one of the key things we are seeing as an emphasis in today's world, is how do we bring more strategic emphasis into our boardroom, because it's that. So the metaphor that I love using is, it's shareholder returns, even EBITDA, is fruit on the tree. And growing a company is about the tree, and a healthy tree, because a healthy tree produces good fruit. If all we do is strip off all of the growth of our companies, which is what can happen either from a purely executive, if you only have executives on the board, and they would often be shareholders, often the emphasis is just reinvest in the business all the time, but not necessarily strategic. That reinvestment is almost just reabsorption of assets into the business, instead of saying, actually, we have a purpose and we need to produce a result, as we're looking for the healthy fruit on the tree. And so part of that is recognizing that it's keeping the right things apart, and recognizing that we call it the three hats, the distinction between shareholders, governors, managers, you know, and the relationship between those. And so there are boundaries, appropriate boundaries, that an independent director. And so this is why one of the key roles on a board that is recommended to be held by an independent director is the chair of the board, because the chair of the board, in a sense, is a boundary monitorer. Phrase I sometimes use, they are aware of the boundaries between these three hats and can keep the right conversations in the right places. And especially as companies grow. So illustration I often use is, companies start with all three: shareholders, the square, circle, board, management, all the same people. Often those companies grow simply because the dynamic and there is good information across all three of those areas, and there is alignment of values, etc. But as companies grow and are successful, we see normally this first separation or first growth being the number of people in the business. And it's at this point we need to start recognizing that the governance role and the management role start to separate, because we're now working with people, working through people that aren't necessarily wearing all three hats. And so ensuring that people are aligned, which we do through a policy framework, is important. And then the next stage, obviously, where companies grow even further, and so they grow not just down, but also up, additional shareholding coming into the equation, either VC funding or private equity funding or angel funding, whatever it is, coming into the business. Again, ensuring that those boundaries between the three hats, the shareholder, the director, and the manager, often an independent director, because they sit outside of that. In other words, they only have one relationship with the company. They can recognize when the other relationships with the company, the shareholding relationship or the executive relationship, starts overriding the discussions in the boardroom. And then it's asking the question, do we have the right structure for the right stage of the business? And again, when I say independent director, I'm assuming the right person at the right time with the right skill set. We spoke about that, as I said, in a previous webinar. But that person or that grouping of people, be it 1, 2, or 3, whatever independent directors, are able then to ask the question, because they're looking from the outside on the business, not just being involved in the business. They have almost an architecture role in the business to say, how do we take all of this stuff called governance or stuff called board process, that obviously there's a lot of information about this, but how do we apply it into this business? Recognizing that as the business goes forward and changes and transitions, as I illustrated on the previous slide, it's going to require different structures. The company itself is the same company, but as companies grow and change, so they require different structures. And so it's the role of the architect that often the independent director brings to the table, is to say, how do we architect, how do we apply the principles of governance? What is being best practice? We're often asked the question, well, what's the best practice on this? And my answer is often, a little bit facetiously, the best practice for you is the best practice for you. Because the danger is, too often, we don't apply the principles of governance and customize it fit for purpose for us. We cut and paste it. And good independent directors are able to look, because they're not looking from inside the company only and asking the question from an operational point of view. They're not at an arm's length and possibly conflicted because of their shareholding relationship, but they can ask the question, what structures are actually in the best interest of this company? So that when we do keep the company and we do architect our governance, we're doing it with the company's best interests in mind, keeping the company front and center in our deliberations. So in deliberations, there are obviously different interests. And so people who wear all three hats, who are not independent directors, often can be swayed or can be making trade-offs with their various relationships with the company in mind. Same with executives, where the exposure to the operations of the business could be, influencing how they deliberate in the discussions. So how do we analyze things? We're bringing different filters. We all have our own filters. And then in the decision making, where ultimately decisions in terms of the law in companies need to be made in the best interest of the company, with directors knowing what they're doing, declaring and avoiding conflict of interest, and acting in the best interests of the company. And it's also then recognizing that architecting a business is a combination of systems and people. And so what I want to do is I want to take you through some of the system elements in terms of architecting governance. Last time we spoke about the board elements, and it's the combination of the board and the systems, the people and the systems, which is where ultimately performance comes from. And as companies grow and as the drivers and the complexities change, so sometimes we need to look at changing our board and rotating our board, adapting our board. We spoke about that last time. Sometimes we need to look at how do we review the governance architecture of the business at both a board level and also at a management level. And so I want to unpack some of those ideas for you in this webinar as we go forward. And what I encourage you to do as we go as well, please ask questions on the different elements that I'm going to talk about, because often we get tied up into this, what is governance and what does it consist of? I want to give you some ideas. And so I recommend as well that if you've got your own company in mind, that you do a bit of an internal audit process to say, well, which are the areas that we need to think about more intentionally or look at redefining? Because the danger is if we don't continually renovate, so thinking about the construction metaphor, if we don't continually renovate our structures and processes and policies in the business, then we end up outgrowing the existing structure. And that's a problem a lot of businesses have as they grow. There are elements of the business that they outgrow, and they need to then renovate and think about that. And I think one of the key, good question, Lloyd. I mean, how does one independent director influence the other directors? It's a critical part, and we'll touch on that a little bit when we think about board process. Where does board process? Because there's obviously there's the structure of the business in a sense, but there's also the structure of the board process that we run. And so I'll touch on those two elements. And if I haven't addressed that question, I think repeat it, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. So the first thing I think when we think about any company is a company is a combination of parts. All right, it's a combination at three hats level between those who have hold shares in a business, those who are the custodians, the legal custodians of the business and structures around that, and then there's the operational part of the business. Some of these parts are more dynamic than others, but it's really important in our governance thinking to first say, well, what are the parts we're working with? Because key part of governance is defining spaces within which activity happens. And the activity that happens is management and the implementation. But the governor's accountability is to think about the spaces in the business. I often say that the big difference and often the big challenge for people who've grown up in an organizational structure and are then promoted to director level is that the perspective in the business is often very legitimately focused on one function or one area of the business. And that's why people do well, because they focus on what they need. They keep the main thing in that area. But the main thing at the board level is the whole. And so it's understanding the whole. But the first thing about the whole is a combination of parts. We unpacked briefly last time this concept of requisite variety. And so it's, go back and re-listen to that webinar. But it's understanding, is the system, so what requisite variety and the law of requisite variety says is that a system must be able to handle and have a greater variety, that's what's called variety, than the variety in the environment within which it exists. And so in designing, in looking at the parts of the business, we've got to look at the environment within which it exists as well. Because ultimately we're looking for businesses that flourish and grow. And so governance architecture, the boundaries. And so most of these would be the forming documents of the business, the foundation documents. In South Africa, we have something called the Memorandum of Incorporation, which sets up the constitution of the business. The Articles of Association, whatever those look like in different parts. In family businesses, we often have the development of a family protocol, family forums at shareholder level to keep that separate from the actual business itself, and recognize that it's setting up those parts of the business are important, because that helps create the distinction. It also helps protect what needs protecting. And remember, the primary thing that needs protecting in the corporate environment is this invisible, never-ending legal entity called the company that is not able to do anything itself. That's why it needs a board who is the custodian of it. It also helps us identify the right things. And so at board level, this would be thinking about, are there different structures we need at board level? In the company level, and I'm going to, quite a bit of information, but it's understanding what are the different parts of the business that need to be stitched together in a sense. So what are the parts of the business that have to do the first two elements at the top there? The marketing, the positioning, the marketing. How does that operate? All right. Remember, this isn't about doing the work, it's defining the parts. Who are the different connections in the market that we're dealing with, and how do we engage with them? The stakeholder approach, in a sense, to thinking. Internally, do we have the right teams? What is the capability and capacity of the teams we need within the business at a governance level? What do we need to deliver what we promise? What do we need to manage the environment we are working through, the risk side, the compliance side? From a financial point of view, what elements of the business have what, influence on the financial performance of the business, and recognizing that. And we'll touch on that in a couple of minutes as well, because that's the critical thing, is that we have the engine of the business, which is a financial engine that ultimately should be delivering the growth and the profitability at the end of the day. And then how do we continually improve it? Once we've got the parts pinned down, in a sense, it's important to ask the question, secondly, how do those parts relate to one another? Because in the business, we often have different functions, different silos or functions that are separated into silos. And it's good to separate the elements, but then it's important to link the elements appropriately. And every business does that in slightly different ways. And so what a governance approach does, and this, remember, we're talking about the perspectives of an independent director. And when I've played that role, sometimes all I've been able to do is ask, why do you do it that way? And sometimes it's, well, we've always done it. Sometimes it's, well, we don't really know. That just happened as a default. And that perspective, no one's asking that question, because everybody has seen it the way that it always is. That's why we also recommend that independent directors don't necessarily come from the sector that a business is in. Because seeing businesses from different angles and different perspectives, coming with other experience, could be an important unlocker of value in a business, because every sector tends to do things in its way. And often we find unique companies, or companies that do better, combine a number of perspectives and say, well, why don't we just put these things together in a different way? Because it's ultimately the linking of the people and the parts that results in performance. Phrase you'll see on one of my last slides is, ultimately, if we think of an organogram, an organogram is a set of functions. And so this is thinking not just of the parts, all right, each of the parts, but it's thinking of what is termed in some cases, what is the white space between the parts? And that's what a relationship does. It's giving the ability of the parts to operate together with other parts. And so this essentially what this does in a business is it takes the decision made at board level into the company and creates the desired impact, right? And that's essentially what the role of a policy framework is. And so one of the things we find independent directors can do is give insight into how do we construct a proper policy framework. You see, the danger is if we don't have policy frameworks in our companies that take decision making into the company and create accountability for that, and then create the desired impact, is our boards then tend to micromanage because they want to rethink and relook at every decision that was made in the business, when actually those decisions should be made in the line of, or in light of, the policy framework that governs that. And so often micromanagement of boards on management is a symptom of not a well-designed policy framework, because that's what a policy framework should aim to do: take decisions into actions to have the desired impact. And the desired impact is obviously the strategic objective of the business. And so it's asking, and so previously I showed you different elements of the business in a sense, in a linear fashion, but ultimately it's about putting it together into the right business model. Because ultimately each company combines different aspects of a business in different ways. And so recognizing what is the unique combination of activities and assets, the people and the partners in the business. So the unique combination of these in the back end of the business creates our value proposition. And every business does that slightly differently. Even businesses in the same sector have a different way of combining. The relating between those different parts of the business is unique, and where the uniqueness comes from. So they look the same from the outside, but the way they actually operate in the back office creates the value. And then it's also how do we then link the relationships and the channels? And so sometimes independent directors come with a different perspective on how to combine. Sometimes they come with a different perspective on how to deliver, because the combining of the elements creates the value. The delivery of the elements is critical to get it to the right people. And then also it's ensuring that it's done efficiently, so that there's ultimately capture of the key value at the end of the day. And so often what happens is people who are involved purely at a shareholding level, or non-executives who are shareholders, or other directors who are executives, would be focused on one part of the business model more than others. The executives often, and this isn't a criticism, but often in this element of the business, we're very involved in what's going on in the back office. Absolutely critical to hold people accountable for that. But that has to be, it's not just the creation of value, it's also the delivery of value. And even a conversation I had earlier today with, it's almost like we've got this fantastic thing. Why aren't people coming to get it from us? Because the creation of the value also requires delivery of the value. And so recognizing that also requires a robust financial stream that is able to then, deliver what needs to be delivered to the business itself, and acting in the best interest of the business itself. And so often that's what independent directors do. They have a view of the whole business as opposed to a nuanced view of only parts of the business. Once one understands that, one can ask the question, well, so it's the parts and the relationships, and then thirdly, it's the element of process, because the parts and the relationships enable the running of processes. And this is where timelines, events, engagements happen. This is where at board level, we have a board process that essentially ensures that we not just are resolving decisions, but behind the scenes in the decision making, there's something that links the values of the business and the values of the individuals to the corporate values, that then is reflected in the way we think together, and then is reflected in the decisions that we make ultimately. And so that's where board process becomes absolutely critical. And so independent directors are able also to look at those elements and say, are we running a robust board process? What are the gaps in our board process? Because remember that these are people who, in one sense, are inside outsiders. They're not exposed to the everyday running of the business. They would need to understand how it works, obviously. They need to understand the business model and often get information from anybody in the business. But because they're not involved in it on an ongoing basis, they're often the ones who can see where the gaps at board level are. As where are we relying too much on the judgment or the influence, going back to Lloyd's question, of individuals. So if I'm an independent director and all I'm doing is going along with the decisions that are made by the executives, because I'm saying, well, I don't have the same access to information, and so they must know better. Instead of saying, how do I get better information? How do we create a better board process that ensures that I am sitting with sufficient information to have the right conversation to also be involved in the decision? Because each seat is precious and each seat is also liable sitting around the boardroom table. And so often independent directors are the ones who see the gaps in both the policy framework. So because as an independent director, I'm not involved in the actions of the business, I'm involved in the decisions, I then need to ask the question, who's being held accountable in the space and how are we holding them accountable for what they're doing? But also the gaps in the back end of saying, is the way we're thinking informed properly by the amount of information we get? So the board pack that I'm relying on to make decisions, is it the right information? Is it structured the right? Are the presentations or the questions I'm asking in the boardroom, are they, relevant? Is it building on the decision-making process, or is it just the duplication? There's no point in having a presentation in the board meeting of exactly what's in the board pack. I may want to ask questions to the person who compiled the report, but if it's just a duplication process, then that's not very efficient. And so independent directors are often the ones who may critique the processes. Remember, we said that independent directors tend to evaluate boards better because they're critiquing the processes that they have to work within. And they have to ask themselves, is it sufficient for the liability I carry as a director of the business? Now, obviously, part of this, and another great comment, Lloyd, is that the pushback process is, and we see it from both executives. Well, we know it's what it is. It's, we're going to go with it, instead of actually recognizing that there needs to be, the information needs to be tested, and the discussions in our thinking processes individually and in the boardroom, the facilitation of those processes, absolutely critical to think about. And a lot of that speaks to, so Lloyd, your comment about independent directors might get pushback from family business. How does one manage that too? The key thing is to raise it, is to say, well, what is the culture? What does the culture need to be around this boardroom table to ensure that we make the decisions in the best interests of the company? We recognize that there's a whole lot of other interests, but in the boardroom, it's about the company. And that often is a culture conversation more than it is a process conversation. As soon as in a boardroom there is no, you can't have that information, you can't have this information, I would question the ability of those directors to make good decisions because of the liability they carry. All directors are equally liable for the performance of the company. And it's important for everybody in the boardroom to recognize that. But it's also recognizing, absolutely, based on the culture of the business, the family connections with the business as well, going back to that question, some of those things need to be resolved at shareholder level before they enter the boardroom. And so recognizing that it's that boundary between the shareholder thinking and the management or the governing thinking that is important to be taking into account, and to be protecting that boundary as well going forward. And so also recognizing that if I'm sitting as an independent director in a company, what I do need to recognize is that ultimately the impact on whatever group of stakeholders we're talking about reflects ultimately the values of the business. You see, the party that is impacted, and this is why key theme in today's world is stakeholder inclusivity and taking into account perceptions in businesses. Ultimately, the stakeholder doesn't ask questions about how the policy framework enabled the right action or held people accountable, or how decisions were made, how the thinking happened. Ultimately, the stakeholder looks at the business and says, this is what you stand for, not based on what you say on your walls, but based on my experience of you as a stakeholder in the business, whether they are an employee, an internal stakeholder, whether they are a customer, part of the supply chain, whether they are the community you operate within. And so this is one of the most important perspectives that often independent directors can give to boards. Is it's about broader than just the business and its shareholders or the business and its operations. It's about the impact of the business on the ecosystem within which it works. And so part of that, again, a good question. Thanks, Ali. One of the key actions is to have a board charter to guide the entity, of course. And this is where the governance structure. So going back to, this key element, one of the key elements, if this is the company, the board charter would say, how does the board set up its role and responsibilities? What is it accountable? How is it held accountable? And that's obviously what reflects what the law says, because then we can appoint individuals to the boards to govern the companies, and that's obviously the relationship element of the business. And so if we don't have those governance elements in place, and this is why in looking and having worked with companies over many years, we often think that's bureaucracy, that we don't want board charters because it's just another piece of paper. It is if it's just a cut and paste from somewhere else, but if it's thought about, if it's contemplated in terms of what it needs to do for this company, what words do we use, how do we structure it? Obviously within the parameters of the law, it becomes an enabling set of documentation. And so board process, or policy and board process, should be enabling in terms of the company. They should all be designed in the best interest of the company at the end of the day. And so some of the key concepts and key thoughts, and please, as we draw to a close, thinking about this concept of what possibly the most important thing, as I said right in the beginning, is that what independent directors bring to the table is the ability to hold these key dimensions of governance. So we spoke earlier about purpose and sustainability. Where are we going? What are we leaving behind in mind? So where does profitability lie? It lies the south. So that's ultimately where EBITDA lies. Okay, not in different terms, but it's a result of obviously what we pursue and what our true north is. The other thing, and this is what a policy framework enables in an organization, is to enable these two poles to be kept in tension as well. Because one of the key things we see in many businesses that don't have an independent voice in the boardroom is they tend to lack accountability for performance. One of the key human characteristics is we tend to judge ourselves by our intentions and other people by their actions. And so often we find in growing businesses that it's very difficult when the person who is the implementer, the CEO, the MD of the company and their team is also only shareholders, or the board consists of all of those people. The fudging of those boundaries makes it very, very difficult to keep people accountable. And so it's in the space between the board and the management team, the operations of the business. It's in this space where accountability for performance happens. And it's in the space that a policy framework obviously provides the space for the organization to operate. And a policy framework has to both give away authority, but also hold people accountable. And I think this is probably one of the key advantages, is when there's someone else in the room who isn't tied to the business in any other way. And I say tied in inverted commas, who doesn't have another interest in the room or in the business, is they're often able to ask the silly questions. I've had the privilege often of sitting in the room as an independent, objective person, and it's facilitated better conversations because the way people talk changes. There's the human dynamic, but there's also the ability to look at a piece of paper and say, well, this is what you targeted, this is what you said you were going to do, and it's not what actually happened. Why? Not to criticize, not to tear apart, but to hold accountable. Because if we can understand and go from the why question to the diagnosis question and unpack that, we can start rebuilding the business, going back to the parts of the business, going back to the relationships of the business, going back to the processes we run. And obviously the other tension, there's this tension on the other side of conformance and financial results, that if we don't keep that in tension with performance, we end up seeing governance as just the set of tick the boxes. And so certainly we need financial, reports that are accurate and, audited, et cetera, that show the results. But that's not what governance is about. Governance is about all of these things, because those things are also an outflow of the purpose and the reason for the company existing. And so that's one of the things that we find independent directors, and especially an independent chair, can do, is hold all of these things in a sense in tension. Where are we going? What do we leave behind? Performance, accountability for performance, especially as the roles in businesses change, be that a multi-generational change in businesses, or be that a founder-led business finding their first, other party to be the CEO of the business. How do you transition that leadership role of CEO well? And it's often independent directors who help have those conversations going forward. And so in terms of key practices, as we wrap up this time together, and thanks again for taking the time. I trust it's been valuable, and I trust that you've been able to look at your own businesses, looking at these key elements and saying, we spoke about the parts of the business, recognizing that every business consists of parts. How do we relate them together? And so maybe you need to relook at how your business is structured. Is that appropriate? Do you have or not have the elements of, as was mentioned, board charters, proper constitution of companies, or proper constitution, or family forum, or shareholders compact, whatever one calls it? How are then those parts related together? And does that properly enable the flow of the business and the processes that exist in the business? And then do you have this concept of renewal? As we said, one of the key findings is that boards with independent directors are more focused on evaluating themselves, and as a result of evaluating themselves, improving themselves going forward. And so the key things are helping to see the whole being those four key elements: parts, relationships, process, and renewal. Understanding the parts and the relationships between the parts, that white space in the organogram, because it's in the relationships that often the value is unlocked. And often those aren't questioned, because that's the way we've always done it around here. And as I mentioned last time, those are known as the 7 most expensive or dangerous words in business. We've always done it this way. Independent directors help us get out of that ditch, in a sense. It's designing to achieve an objective. So when we're thinking about designing our thinking processes, do those reflect our values? Have we had a conversation around what organizational values are necessary for this company to achieve its strategic objective? Is that thinking and deciding process well designed? And does it lead to proper action? So the board process flowing into the policy framework of the business, and keeping the end in mind, keeping the main thing, as Stephen Covey said. And so those are some thoughts. I think it's really important to audit your business, in a sense, in your own mind. What are the different elements? Take that view, look from the outside looking in, because that's what governors do, is they look on the whole business. Please also, as you think of last questions or comments, please also participate in the 2020 survey, so that we can get more information, establish more of a benchmark about what's happening throughout Africa. And also provide more insight in terms of what are the most successful companies doing out there, especially companies that look and feel like the companies you're involved in. Because often we learn from massive businesses that are very unlike ours. Actually, we want to get an idea of what is happening on the ground through the survey. Some of the other areas we can help with as I draw to a close, and if there are no other questions, please pop them up there if you have questions or comments in mind. You can also contact us. As we said up front, we help match directors and companies. So if you're in that space where you're saying, how do I construct a board? How do I put it together? And then how also do I think about my governance? We can help assess that and match the right people through an evaluation process, an assessment process, and then our appointment processes as well. We're also involved very heavily, obviously, in board and directorship education. Some of the concepts that we've unpacked today, we unpack in more detail on our 11-month program, the Applied Directorship program, as well as some of our more focused one-day programs that are coming up. So please look at our calendar for that. Please contact us going forward. There are our details of the different regions that we operate in. Thanks so much for taking the time, for making the time, and I'll be signing off if there are no further questions.